What does it mean to be an artist? I think being an artist gives you the freedom to think outside the box. Like if I make a jar of peanut butter, I do that as an artistic act, even though it's a very ordinary thing. I think having the freedom to do ordinary things with a sense of you reframing things, taking things that are everyday and overlooked and offering them up to people and saying, look at this differently. I think it's quite a privilege actually, because I didn't choose to think in this way, but I think it gives you quite a lot of freedom. What does your art practice say about you? Maybe that I'm a bit of a pessimist. My work's changed quite a lot over the last few years. I think when I was at uni I realised that there was a lot of my work that was very controlled, and I think I was quite uptight about the way I was working, or the kind of work that I was making. It showed me that I was trying to have too much control when actually I needed to learn to be okay with uncertainty. And actually that's a contradiction because I'm a pessimist. Yeah, I think maybe I've kind of looked for structures or put structures into my work because I was uncomfortable about the uncertainty, and I needed to learn to be okay with that. So how has that shown up in your work? When I was first doing my degree, I was making a lot of very overtly political work, and I was doing a lot of research about the role of the individual in society. I was reading a lot about the notions of nationality and multiculturalism, and it was just at a time when the coalition government came in, and there was a lot of talk about the big society and national identity, which hadn't really been talked about when Labour were in power, and I was really interested in that, and I was wanting to illustrate these concepts and ideas that I'd been researching, and actually from an artistic point of view that wasn't really that interesting because I was kind of telling people what to think rather than inviting people to look at and question these things. So yeah, I'd make these very didactic works, whether that was performances or whatever. And I think towards the end of my degree I found joy in just playing with materials and letting things be ambiguous and being okay with that. And actually the idea of society and people being in a state of flux, which was kind of what was happening and is still happening now, which was perfect because it was kind of feeding into these things I was making, but I wasn't setting criteria of what they were about. I was just kind of trusting my instinct and what happens if I put that next to that, and meaning was coming out of it, but I wasn't dictating that from the beginning. What else can you tell me about ideas, interests and concepts that show up in your work? I think towards the end of my degree, since I graduated, I've been really caught up in this notion of my life and art not being two separate things and overlapping, and I think, yeah, that's informing my practice at the moment, the idea of how I live my life. I'm curious about how your political explorations are showing up in your work now, but you're not being descriptive. I think even when I was being quite overtly political, I don't think I was necessarily taking a political stance because I was still not sure where I fit with all of that. But I would use the Union Jack or dress up as a riot police officer. I'd use quite aggressive images, whereas now I'm interested in how I live my life and that being an art piece. So things like how I produce and consume food, very basic everyday things. For example, growing or making my own food rather than buying it from a supermarket chain, seeing that as a political act. I think that somebody like Frances Elise, who looks at political situations but in a very poetic and subtle way, I think that has more of a lasting impact than other artists, and certainly the way I was working, which it's a bit like a smack in the face, but a one-liner, and once that initial shock has worn off, you're like, well, what's underneath that? What is your definition of success? I was having this conversation with a friend of mine actually recently, she lives in London, and she's not an artist, but she's like, I don't understand why you're not in London. Surely if you want to succeed as an artist, why are you not in London? And her definition of success was being in the capital city where everything happens, and I think I recognise in myself that the tendency to think that I have to be exhibiting or I have to be making a living from my art practice. And I think if I'm not careful I tend to strive towards the obvious markers of success. But I think more recently I'm thinking about it in the sense of integrity and actually doing things that you believe in and enjoy. And for somebody like my friend Louisa, who I mentioned earlier, her life is her practice, and she sticks by that even though it's a massive inconvenience for her at times. I see that as a mark of success because she has that integrity, and what she does actually, it benefits a lot of people. It's pretty amazing.